June 22, 1941. The largest invasion force in human history stood poised on the border of the Soviet Union. 3 million men. 3,000 tanks. The full might of the German Wehrmacht and the fanatical elite of the Waffen SS. The mood among the German commanders was not just confident, it was dismissive. They had conquered Poland in weeks. They had crushed France, a supposed superpower, in just 6 weeks. They believed they were invincible. But more importantly, they believed they were racially superior. The Nazi ideology, which permeated the Waffen SS, taught that the Slavic people of the East were, to mention, subhumans. 1. They believed that a society of subhumans was incapable of producing advanced technology. Adolf Hitler had famously declared, "We have only to kick in the door, and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down too." German intelligence reports on Soviet armor were woefully inadequate. They knew the Soviets had thousands of tanks, but they assumed they were obsolete junk. They expected to face the T-26 and the BT-7 light tanks with thin armor that could be destroyed by a heavy machine gun. The German Panzer divisions, the spearhead of the Blitzkrieg, felt untouchable. Their Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks were considered the pinnacles of engineering. They had radios in every tank. They had excellent optics. They had highly trained crews. The SS commanders, sitting in their command vehicles, looked east with a sneer. They expected a primitive enemy. They expected to drive to Moscow before the snow fell. They viewed the Red Army not as a modern military force, but as a disorganized rabble that would scatter at the first sight of the Iron Cross. This arrogance was blinding. It wasn't just a military underestimation, it was a cultural delusion. They simply could not conceive that the backward Russians could build a machine that rivaled their own. As the engines roared to life and the tracks began to churn up the dust of the Russian steppe, the Germans were driving into a trap of their own making. They were prepared for a short, sharp campaign against an inferior foe. They were not prepared for what was waiting for them in the forests and fields of the Ukraine. They were about to meet a ghost. A monster. A machine that would shatter their racial theories and break the back of their armored supremacy. The TR-34 was waiting. And it wasn't a primitive toy. It was the future of warfare. In the first weeks of Operation Barbarossa, the German advance was spectacular. They encircled entire Soviet armies. They captured hundreds of thousands of prisoners. The Luftwaffe ruled the skies. The German panzers sliced through the Soviet lines like a hot knife through butter. The standard German anti-tank gun at the time was the 3.7 cm Pak 36. It was a small, lightweight gun that had performed well in France and Poland. The crews called it the Heeresanklopgerät, the army door-knocking device. 3. It was a joke. A term of endearment. But in July 1941, the joke stopped being funny. Advanced German units began to encounter a new shape on the battlefield. It wasn't the boxy, riveted tanks they were used to seeing. It was sleek. It was low to the ground. And it was moving fast. The German gunners did what they were trained to do. They set up their 3.7 cm guns. They waited for the tank to get within range. 500 meters. Fire. They watched the tracer streak toward the target. Clang. A spark. The shell ricocheted off the front armor of the Soviet tank and flew harmlessly into the sky. The German gunners were confused. They reloaded. 300 meters. Fire. Clang. Another ricochet. The Soviet tank didn't stop. It didn't even slow down. It kept coming. Panic began to set in. The German gunners frantically loaded special tungsten cord ammunition, rare and expensive shells designed for the heaviest armor. 100 meters. Point-blank range. Fire. Clang. The Tu-34 rolled right over the gun, crushing it and its crew into the mud. This scene played out up and down the Eastern Front. The Waffen SS units, equipped with the best gear Germany had, found themselves helpless. Their Panzer IIIs, with their 37mm or 50mm guns, fired round after round at the T-34s. The shells simply bounced off. One report from the 1st Panzer Division described a Tu-34 that took 23 hits from a 37mm anti-tank gun and 2 hits from a 50mm tank gun. It suffered no damage. The Tu-34 then turned its turret and destroyed the German tanks with its powerful 76mm gun. The German soldiers stared in horror. This primitive enemy, these subhumans, had built a tank that was virtually immune to standard German weapons. The door knocker was useless. The arrogance of the first weeks evaporated instantly, replaced by a cold, terrifying realization. The technological advantage did not belong to Germany. It belonged to the Soviet Union. General Heinz Guderian was the father of the Blitzkrieg .4. He was the man who wrote the book on tank warfare, literally. His book Achtung, Panzer was the Bible of the German armored forces. He was commanding the 2nd Panzer Group, driving toward Moscow. In October 1941, near the town of Mtsensk, his forces ran headlong into the 4th Tank Brigade of the Red Army. It was a massacre. But this time, it was the Germans who were being massacred. The Soviet T-34s, utilizing their superior speed and armor, ambushed Guderian's panzers. They fired from the woods, destroyed the lead German tanks, and then maneuvered to hit the flanks. Guderian was shocked. He wrote in his diary, the superiority of the T-34 was very apparent. Our guns could only penetrate it at extremely short ranges. He noted that the T-34 could kill a Panzer from 1,000 meters, while the Panzer had to get within 300 meters to even scratch the Tu-34. This was a crisis. For the first time in the war, the German offensive was stalled not by numbers, but by a superior machine. Guderian frantically sent reports back to Berlin. He demanded a commission be sent to the front immediately to inspect the captured T-34s. He wanted the top tank designers, Ferdinand Porsche, the engineers from Daimler-Benz and MAN, to see this thing with their own eyes. When the commission arrived, they were stunned. They climbed over the captured T-34s. They measured the armor. They tested the engine. They found that the primitive Russians had used an aluminum diesel engine. The Germans were still using petrol, gasoline, engines. Petrol burns easily. Diesel does not. The Tu-34 was safer, had better range, and was more reliable in the heat of battle. The German engineers were humiliated. They realized that their own tanks, the pride of the Wehrmacht, were obsolete. There was serious discussion about simply copying the Tu-34. Guderian suggested they just build an exact replica of the Soviet tank in German factories. But the German industrial pride wouldn't allow it. They couldn't admit that the Untermenschen had designed a better tank. And practically, they couldn't do it. The T-34's engine required aluminum alloy, which Germany didn't have in sufficient quantities. So, they decided to design a new tank, a counter Tu-34. This would eventually become the Panther. But in the meantime, Guderian and his men were left to fight a nightmare. They had to face a tank they couldn't kill, operated by an enemy who was fighting for his very survival. That fast Heinz Guderian, the master of speed, had been stopped cold by a piece of Russian steel. What made the T-34 so special? Why did it terrify the Germans so much? It wasn't just one thing. It was the golden triangle of tank design, firepower, protection, and mobility. Most tanks in 1941 had two of these. The Tu-34 had all three. The genius behind the tank was a man named Mikhail Koshkin. He died before the war started, killed by pneumonia contracted while test driving the prototype Tu-34 in the freezing winter. But his legacy was the sloped armor. Before the Tu-34, most tanks were boxes. Vertical plates of steel bolted together. The German Panzer III and IV were boxes. The British tanks were boxes. When a shell hits a vertical plate, it has to punch through the thickness of the metal. Simple physics. Koshkin angled the armor of the Tu-34 back at 60 degrees. 5. This did two things. First, it effectively doubled the thickness of the steel. A 45 mm plate angled at 60 degrees presents 90 mm of steel to an incoming shell. The Germans were shooting at 45 mm of steel, but they were hitting 90 mm. Second, and more importantly, it caused deflection. Shells didn't bite into the sloped steel, they slid off. They ricocheted. The energy of the impact was dissipated upwards. It was a simple, elegant solution that rendered existing anti-tank guns obsolete. Then there was the suspension. Koshkin used the Christie suspension, an American design that had been rejected by the US Army but bought by the Soviets. 6. It used large road wheels and long coil springs. This allowed the Tu-34 to travel at high speeds over rough terrain without shaking the crew to death. And finally, the tracks. German tanks had narrow tracks. They were designed for the paved roads of Western Europe. The Tu-34 had massive, wide tracks. 7. This gave it low ground pressure. It didn't sink. It floated over the mud and the snow. While German tanks were getting bogged down, digging their own graves in the Russian earth, the Tu-34 could dance around them. It was a tank designed specifically for the environment of the Eastern Front. It was rugged. It was simple. It didn't have the refined finish of a German tank. The welds were rough. The interior was cramped and uncomfortable. There was no turret basket, so the loader had to dance around the spent shell casings on the floor. But it worked. It started in the freezing cold of the Russian winter. It ran on low-quality fuel. It could be fixed with a hammer and a wrench. The Waffen SS commanders had mocked the crude finish of the Soviet tanks. They looked at the rough welds and laughed. But they stopped laughing when they realized that a rough weld holds just as well as a polished one. The Tu-34 was not designed to look good at a parade. It was designed to win a war of annihilation. And it was about to prove that good enough is often better than perfect. By October 1941, the German advance toward Moscow was slowing down. It wasn't just the stiffening Soviet resistance. It was the earth itself. The Russian autumn brought the Rasputitsa, the season of bad roads. The rains came, and the dirt roads of the Soviet Union turned into a sticky, bottomless quagmire. For the German Panzer divisions, this was a catastrophe. The German tanks, designed for the paved highways of Western Europe, had narrow tracks. When a 25-ton Panzer drove onto the muddy road, it didn't drive over the mud, it sliced into it. The narrow tracks acted like knives, digging deeper and deeper until the tank was bellied out, its hull resting on the mud, its tracks spinning helplessly in the slime. The entire Wehrmacht ground to a halt. Supply trucks sank to their axles. Horses died of exhaustion trying to pull artillery pieces through the muck. But then, the German soldiers saw something that demoralized them even more than the mud. They saw the Tu-34. The Soviet tank had massive, wide tracks. Where the German tank sank, the Tu-34 floated. Its wide tracks distributed the weight of the tank over a larger surface area, acting like snowshoes. German infantrymen, shivering in their summer uniforms, watched in disbelief as T-34s glided past their stuck convoys, maneuvering with ease to flank their positions. The subhumans had built a machine that conquered the environment. Then came the winter. The temperature dropped to -40 degrees. The German oil froze. The German grease turned into glue. To start a Panzer engine in the morning, the crews had to light fires under the hull to thaw out the oil, a dangerous and time-consuming process. If they turned the engine off, it might never start again. The Tu-34, however, used a compressed air starter system. It didn't rely on a battery that could freeze. The Soviet crews just opened a valve, compressed air shot into the cylinders, and the diesel engine roared to life. The diesel fuel also had a lower freezing point than German gasoline. The Waffen SS commanders, who had prided themselves on their technical superiority, found themselves fighting a war where their technology was a liability. Their telescopic sights fogged up. Their machine guns jammed in the cold. The Tu-34 kept running. It was a brutal lesson in engineering for the environment. The Germans had built a precision instrument. The Soviets had built a sledgehammer. And in the freezing mud of Russia, you can't kill anything with a scalpel. You need a hammer. The psychological toll on the SS crews was immense. They were freezing to death, unable to move, while the inferior enemy was swarming around them. They began to realize that the Tu-34 wasn't just a tank, it was a creature of the steppe. It belonged there. They did not. The Tu-34 used the winter as a weapon. Soviet tactics shifted. They painted their tanks white. They attacked during blizzards, appearing out of the whiteout like ghosts. They hit the Germans when they were most vulnerable, when they were trying to warm their hands or dig their trucks out of the snow. General Winter had joined the Red Army, and his chariot was the Tu-34. While the Tu-34 was holding the line at Moscow, an even greater miracle was happening behind the lines. In 1941, As the Germans advanced, the Soviet Union faced a crisis. Their main tank factories were in Kharkov and Leningrad, directly in the path of the German army. If these factories were captured, the war was over. So, Stalin ordered the impossible. He ordered the factories to be moved. Not just the blueprints. Not just the staff. The entire factories. Every lathe, every press, every generator, every bolt was unbolted, loaded onto flatbed trains, and shipped thousands of miles east, behind the Ural Mountains. They arrived in the city of Chelyabinsk. It was renamed Tankograd, Tank City. The conditions were horrific. When the trains arrived, there were no buildings. There was just snow and open ground. The workers, many of them women, children, and elderly men, because the young men were at the front, unloaded the heavy machinery in sub-zero temperatures. They set up the assembly lines in the open air. They started building tanks before the roof was even built over the factory. They worked 16-hour shifts. They slept on the floor next to their machines. They froze. They starved. But they built tanks. The manager of the factory, Isaac Zaltzman, known as the King of Tanks, was ruthless. He simplified the design of the Tu-34. Every part that wasn't essential was deleted. The Germans spent hundreds of hours polishing the welds on their tanks. The Soviets stopped polishing. Does it hold? Good. Move on. They stopped painting the interiors. They stopped installing rubber on the road wheels because of rubber shortages. The Tu-34 became rougher, uglier, and noisier. But it became faster to build. In 1942, while German industry was struggling to produce 500 tanks a month, the Soviet Union was producing 2,000. The Waffen SS commanders couldn't understand it. They would destroy a Soviet tank regiment in the morning, and by the afternoon, a fresh regiment would take its place. They called it the Hydra. Cut off one head, and two more appear. They didn't realize that the Hydra was a production line in the Urals driven by total war. The quality of the individual Tu-34 dropped. The sights were often crude. The transmissions were stiff, drivers sometimes had to use a sledgehammer to change gears. But quantity has a quality all its own. The Germans were looking for a duel. The Soviets were looking for a flood. The Tu-34s rolling out of Tankograd didn't even have to be tested. They were driven straight from the factory door onto waiting trains, and from the trains straight into battle. Some were barely painted. Some still had the chalk marks from the welders on the armor. But they had a 76mm gun, and they could kill a German. This was the industrial miracle that doomed the Third Reich. The SS believed in the superiority of the Aryan warrior. But the warrior was defeated by the factory worker. By the grandmother operating a drill press in -30-degree weather. By the teenager welding armor plate until his eyes burned. Tankograd was the anvil upon which the German army was smashed. By 1942, the German High Command had swallowed its pride. They admitted that the Panzer III and IV were obsolete. They needed a tank that could beat the Tu-34. They formed the Panther Commission. They looked at the captured Tu-34s and said, "Build us one of these." Daimler-Benz actually proposed a design that was almost a carbon copy of the Tu-34. It had the diesel engine, the rear transmission, and the exact same shape. But the German military establishment rejected it. It looked too much like a Russian tank. They were worried about friendly fire. And, deeper down, their racial pride couldn't accept a direct copy. So, Maschinenfabrik Augsburg-Nürnberg won the contract with a more German design. The Panzer V Panther. On paper, the Panther was a masterpiece. It took the sloped armor of the T-34 and made it thicker. It took the wide tracks of the T-34 and adopted them. It mounted a high-velocity 75mm gun that was far superior to the Soviet 76mm. It had excellent optics and a comfortable interior. But in trying to build a super T-34, the Germans fell into their old trap. Over-engineering. The T-34 was simple. The Panther was a nightmare of complexity. It used an interleaving road wheel system. This gave a smooth ride, but if mud got in between the wheels and froze, the tank couldn't move. Replacing a single inner wheel took hours of mechanic work. The engine was powerful but prone to overheating. The transmission was weak and broke constantly under the weight of the 45-ton vehicle. Hitler rushed the Panther into production for the Battle of Kursk in 1943. He wanted a wonder weapon. What he got was a disaster. When the first Panthers arrived at the front, many of them broke down before they even saw the enemy. Engine fires were common. 2 Panthers burned to the ground just unloading from the train because of fuel leaks. In the first days of Kursk, more Panthers were lost to mechanical failure than to enemy fire. The T-34 crews, meanwhile, were driving a tank that had been refined over 2 years of war. It wasn't perfect, but it ran. The German response to the T-34 highlighted the fundamental difference in philosophy. The Germans wanted a tank that was 100% effective on the battlefield, even if it took 100 hours to build and maintain. The Soviets accepted a tank that was 80% effective, as long as they could build 10,000 of them. The Panther was, individually, a better tank than the T-34. In a one-on-one duel, the Panther would win almost every time. But war is not a series of one-on-one duels. While the Germans were frantically trying to change the transmission on a broken Panther in the mud, 3 T-34s were flanking them. The Germans had copied the shape of the T-34, but they hadn't understood its soul. They tried to gentrify a brawler. And in the brutal attrition of the Eastern Front, fragility was a death sentence. The Panther became a feared predator, yes. But it was an endangered species from the moment it was born. July 1943. The Battle of Kursk. This was the moment the war turned. Hitler had gathered his greatest armada. The elite SS Panzer divisions, Leibstandard, Das Reich, Totenkopf. They were equipped with the new Tigers and Panthers. Their goal was to pinch off the Kursk salient and destroy the Soviet armored reserves. But the Soviets knew they were coming. They had prepared a defense in depth. Miles of minefields, anti-tank ditches, and artillery zones. And behind those lines sat the tank army. Thousands of T-34s. The climax of the battle occurred at Prokhorovka. It is often called the largest tank battle in history. The SS tanks pushed forward across the open steppe. Their long-range guns destroyed T-34s from 2 kilometers away. The Soviet commander, General Rotmistrov, realized that if he fought a long-range duel, he would lose. The Tiger and Panther guns were too strong. So he gave a desperate order: steel on steel. He ordered his T-34s to charge. Full speed. Do not stop to fire. Close the distance. It was a suicidal charge. Hundreds of T-34s raced across the fields, engine screaming, dust billowing. Many exploded as the German heavy guns picked them off. But there were too many of them. They closed the gap. They got inside the range of the German guns. The battle turned into a chaotic, swirling melee. T-34s were driving between the Tiger tanks. At point-blank range, the T-34's 76mm gun could penetrate the side armor of a Tiger. It was like a pack of wolves attacking a bear. T-34s were ramming German tanks. Soviet crews, their tanks burning, steered their machines into the enemy to take them down with them. The German advantage in optics and range was nullified. The SS commanders were horrified. They were used to methodical, tactical battles. This was a bar fight. Turrets were blown off. Tanks crashed into each other. The smoke was so thick the sun was blotted out. The T-34s were taking horrific losses. But for every T-34 that burned, another one appeared. The Germans destroyed 400 Soviet tanks that day. But they lost 80 of their own precious heavy tanks. And the difference was, the Soviets could replace their losses the next day. The Germans could not. The elite SS divisions had been fought to a standstill by the Horde. Prokhorovka broke the back of the German Panzerwaffe. They had thrown their best punch, and the T-34 had taken it on the chin and stayed standing. The SS officers, looking out over the smoking graveyards of their tanks, realized the war was lost. They had superior technology. They had superior training. But they had been beaten by a tank that refused to die and a nation that refused to break. The T-34 had proven that it wasn't just a door knocker. It was the tank that won the war. At Kursk, the legend of German invincibility died in the dust, crushed under the wide tracks of Mikhail Koshkin's masterpiece. By late 1943, the arms race on the Eastern Front had shifted again. The Germans had introduced the Tiger and the Panther in significant numbers. The standard T-34, with its 76mm gun, was losing its edge. While it was still superior in mobility, it could no longer penetrate the frontal armor of the German Cats from a safe distance. Soviet tankers found themselves in a deadly predicament. To kill a Tiger, they had to get within suicide range, often under 500 meters, while the Tiger could kill them from 2,000 meters. The crew sent desperate feedback to the design bureaus: give us a longer arm. Stalin demanded an immediate solution. The Soviet engineers didn't try to invent a whole new tank. That would take too long and disrupt production. Instead, they looked at their existing arsenal. They had an excellent 85mm anti-aircraft gun, the 52K. It was powerful, reliable, and capable of punching through German heavy armor. The challenge was fitting this massive gun into the T-34. The existing turret was too small. So, the designers at the Ural Tank Factory No. 183 created a new, larger turret. It was cast from steel, with thick, sloped sides. This new tank was designated the Tu-34-85. It was the ultimate evolution of the design. But the upgrade wasn't just about the gun. It fixed the T-34's biggest flaw, the two-man turret. In the old Tu-34-76, the commander also had to act as the gunner. He was overworked. He had to command the tank, find targets, aim the gun, and fire, all while the loader scrambled around him. This reduced the tank's combat efficiency. The commander had tunnel vision. The new Tu-34-85 turret was large enough for 3 men, a commander, a gunner, and a loader. Finally, the Soviet tank commander could focus on commanding. He could look out for threats, coordinate with other tanks, and direct the driver. This leveled the tactical playing field. When the Tu-34-85 arrived at the front in early 1944, the German tankers were in for a nasty surprise. They were used to T-34 shells bouncing off their Tigers. But now, the Tu-34 could bite back. The 85mm shell could penetrate the Tiger's frontal armor at 1,000 meters. It could knock out a Panther from the front if it hit the turret cheeks. The German sense of invulnerability, already shaken at Kursk, was shattered. The Tu-34 was no longer just a swarm tank. It was a heavy hitter. And unlike the German tanks, which were becoming heavier, slower, and more unreliable with every upgrade, the Tu-34-85 kept its mobility. It retained the wide tracks. It retained the reliable diesel engine. It was still the queen of the steppe, but now she carried a broadsword instead of a dagger. The Germans tried to respond with the King Tiger, a 70-ton monster. But the King Tiger was a logistical nightmare. It couldn't cross bridges. It drank fuel like water. The Tu-34-85 was the Goldilocks tank. Not too heavy, not too light. Just right. It was the perfect balance of firepower, protection, and mobility. And, crucially, it was still cheap to build. While Germany struggled to build 100 Tigers, the Soviet Union churned out 1,000 T-34-85s. The Waffen SS commanders watched with dread as the silhouette of the enemy tank changed. The small turret was gone. The long barrel was here. And there were thousands of them. By 1944, the war had devolved into a grim mathematical equation. The German Panzerwaffe produced some of the most skilled tank aces in history. Men like Otto Carius, Michael Wittmann, and Kurt Nispel. These men were masters of their craft. Operating in their Tigers and Panthers, they racked up incredible kill counts. It was not uncommon for a single Tiger crew to destroy 10, 15, or even 20 Soviet tanks in a single day. The German propaganda machine celebrated these heroes. They were the shield of Europe. But on the ground, the reality was horrific. Imagine you are a German tank commander. You are elite. You are in a superior machine. You ambush a column of T-34s. You destroy the first one. Then the second. Then the third. Your crew is working perfectly. You are a killing machine. But then you look through your periscope. 3 more T-34s are emerging from the tree line. You engage them. You kill them. You are running low on ammunition. Your engine is overheating. Your crew is exhausted. And then, 5 more T-34s appear on the horizon. This was the nightmare of the Eastern Front. It didn't matter how good you were. It didn't matter how many medals you wore. You simply ran out of shells before the Soviets ran out of tanks. The Waffen SS commanders called it the Russian steamroller. There was a terrifying relentlessness to the Soviet advance. They were willing to take casualties that would have broken any Western army. The Soviet philosophy was cold and pragmatic. If it cost 3 T-34s to destroy 1 Tiger, that was an acceptable trade. Why? Because the Soviet Union could build 10 T-34s in the time it took Germany to build 1 Tiger. And they could train 10 crews in the time it took Germany to train 1. The German elites began to feel like they were fighting a hydra. Every victory was temporary. Every defensive line was temporary. The T-34s just kept coming. They swarmed the flanks. They drove through minefields to clear a path for the others. The psychological toll on the German crews was crushing. They knew that a single mistake meant death. If their track broke, if they got stuck in the mud, they would be overrun. The Soviets, on the other hand, fought with a fatalistic fury. They knew their tank was rough. They knew they might die. But they also knew they were winning. The sight of an endless sea of green tanks, with the red stars painted on their turrets, broke the spirit of the Wehrmacht. The German officers who had once mocked the subhuman Slavs now looked at them with fear. They realized that they had awakened a giant. The T-34 wasn't just a machine anymore. It was a force of nature. It was the physical embodiment of the Soviet will to survive and destroy. The elite SS divisions were slowly ground down, not by superior skill, but by the crushing weight of numbers and the relentless hammer of the T-34. The horde had arrived, and the elite had nowhere left to run. June 22, 1944. Exactly 3 years to the day after the German invasion of Russia. While the world's eyes were focused on Normandy and the D-Day landings in the West, the Soviet Union launched the largest offensive of the entire war in the East. Operation Bag Ration. The target was Army Group Center, the strongest German force remaining on Soviet soil. The Germans expected the attack to come in the south, in Ukraine, where the terrain was hard and flat, and perfect for tanks. They had concentrated their armor there. They left the center, in Belorussia, relatively weak. Why? Because Belorussia was covered in swamps, marshes, and dense forests. The German High Command believed it was tank-proof. They looked at their maps and saw the Pripyat marshes. They said, no army can move heavy armor through that. They underestimated the T-34 one last time. The Soviet commanders, Rokossovsky and Zhukov, planned a masterstroke. They used the T-34's wide tracks to do the impossible. They built corduroy roads, laying down logs across the swamps. The T-34s, with their low ground pressure, drove over the marshes that would have swallowed a tiger or a panther. When the attack began, the Germans were stunned. Tanks appeared in places where tanks shouldn't be. They burst out of the forests and the swamps, bypassing the German strong points. It wasn't an attack, it was a flood. The Soviet deep battle doctrine was fully unleashed. Once the line was broken, the T-34s didn't stop to fight the infantry. They kept driving deep into the German rear. They hit the command posts. They hit the supply depots. They cut the rail lines. Army Group Center collapsed. It was a catastrophe worse than Stalingrad. In a matter of weeks, 28 German divisions were annihilated. The German front line was torn open, creating a gap 250 miles wide. Through that gap poured the Red Army. The T-34s were unstoppable. They drove so fast that they often outran their own supply trucks. They siphoned fuel from captured German depots and kept going. Tank riders, Soviet infantry armed with PPSH submachine guns, rode on the back of the T-34s, spraying fire at any German who tried to stop them. The German retreat turned into a rout. Columns of fleeing German soldiers were run down by the tanks. That master race was running for its life. Operation Bag Ration proved that the T-34 was the supreme operational weapon of the war. It wasn't about dueling tigers. It was about mobility. It was about moving an army 400 miles in 2 weeks. The German generals watched their maps in horror as the Red Arrow swept across Belorussia and into Poland. The T-34 had destroyed the backbone of the Wehrmacht. The road to Berlin was no longer a contest. It was a race. And the T-34 was winning. April 1945. Berlin. The capital of the Third Reich was a ruin of concrete and twisted steel. The city that Hitler had promised would last 1,000 years was burning. And rolling through the smoke-filled streets came the T-34s. The final battle for Berlin was a brutal, claustrophobic nightmare. Tanks are not designed for city fighting. The narrow streets were death traps. German defenders, old men and young boys from the Hitler Youth, hid in the ruins with Panzerfausts. These disposable anti-tank weapons could destroy a T-34 with a single hit. The Soviet crews had to improvise again. They welded bed springs and wire mesh onto the sides of their turrets. The idea was to detonate the Panzerfaust warhead before it hit the main armor. It looked crude. It looked ugly. But it was the final evolution of the soldier's tank. The T-34s fought block by block, house by house. They blasted holes in buildings so the infantry could advance. They acted as mobile battering rams. The SS diehards fought fanatically, defending the Reichstag and the Führerbunker. But they couldn't stop the tide. There is a famous photograph of the Battle of Berlin. It shows a Tu-34-85 parked in front of the Brandenburg Gate. Soviet soldiers are dancing on top of it, playing accordions, waving red flags. The tank is dirty. Its fenders are bent. It is covered in dust and soot. It is a stark contrast to the shiny, polished Panzer IIIs that had invaded Russia for years earlier. The German officers who had smirked in 1941 were dead, captured, or hiding in cellars. Their arrogance had been their undoing. They had mocked the Tu-34 as a primitive tractor. But that tractor had driven all the way from Moscow to Berlin. It had survived the mud, the snow, the tigers, and the Stukas. It had been produced in the tens of thousands by a nation that refused to die. The Tu-34 remains the most influential tank in history. It changed the way the world thought about armored warfare. It proved that the best weapon is not the one with the most complex engineering, but the one that can be built, maintained, and fought in the harshest conditions. The legacy of the Tu-34 is written in the ruins of the Third Reich. It was the machine that broke the back of fascism. The German generals wanted a wonder weapon. The Soviets built a winner. And as the red flag rose over the Reichstag, the roar of the Tu-34 diesel engine was the sound of total victory.